going to need this too in a few minutes. But okay, tonight we're going to be looking at Joshua chapter 9. Joshua chapter 9. I found this chapter very encouraging. Let me tell you why. In the few years of my life, I have managed to make many, many unwise decisions. And the passage for tonight tells us that God has the ability to bring good out of unwise decisions. So, let's look at the text. Now, chapter 8 concluded with Joshua leading the people of Israel to renew their covenant with him. We saw that in the end of chapter 8. And chapter 9 occurs right after that, or at least soon thereafter. And so we read in verses 1 and 2, as soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland, all along the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and my old friend Will Varner used to include the mosquito bites, as all of these countries or groups of people heard of this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. So beyond the Jordan means on the western side of the Jordan. So as all of these kings heard about what God had done for Israel, heard about what God had done for Israel at Jericho, and the second time at Ai, they know if they're going to defeat Israel, they have to all band together. There has to be a coalition. From their perspective, it's their only hope. So they gathered together, verse 2 said, as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. Well, they, however, were not totally united, all of the people of that on the Transjordan, on that side of the Jordan, because verse 3 tells us, but when the inhabitants of Gibeon, a city not too far from Jerusalem, when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they, on their part, acted with cunning and went and made ready provisions and took worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins and worn out and torn and mended with worn-out patched sandals on their feet and worn-out clothes, and all their provisions were dry and crumbly. So they had worn-out clothes. Now, you know, today in our society, clothes that look like that, you actually have to pay more for. Many years ago, when this trend was first starting, I think my daughter was in high school, and she brought a friend of hers over to our house, and her dad was a pastor, and she had these jeans, and the jeans had a hole in the knee. Now, I'm thinking about many years ago, when I had a hole in my knee, my mom would put a patch over that. But here she had this, and I'm thinking to myself, I wonder, since he's a pastor of a home missions church, maybe he's not making enough money to provide clothes for his kids. And so I was really concerned about that until my daughter brought me up to date and helped me to understand that actually that's in style, and probably she paid more for those than for jeans without holes. But that wasn't the case here. These people are doing something intentional to try to fool the Israelites. So they took worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins, worn out, torn, mended, with worn-out patched sandals on their feet, worn-out clothes, and all their provisions were dry and crumbly. They're really very clever. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, and they said to him and to the men of Israel, and I can imagine the way they said it, we have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us. So did they hear somehow that God had said to Israel, you don't make any covenants with the people living in the land. They're all to be exterminated. With the implication that they could make covenants with people living outside of the promised land. If they didn't know that, they must have come up with this as the best possible solution to their problem. So they come to Joshua and to the people of Israel, and they say, we have come from a distant country, so now make a treaty, a covenant with us. But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, and remember, we're going to encounter Gibeonites and Hivites. Hivites is what's the right word I want? The ethnic term, and Gibeonites is the term to refer to the city where they lived. So the Hivites from Gibeon, the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you live among us, then how can we make a covenant with you? They said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you? And from where do you come? Now, at first, it's really clever. We are your servants. Hey, look, we're on your team. I don't think they meant at that point, we are literally your slaves. They may have meant that. But I suspect they meant something more respectful, like you often find people saying in the Old Testament. Who are you, and where do you come from? Joshua said to them. And they said to him, from a very distant country your servants have come, because of the name of the Lord your God. Wow, that was pretty clever. The reason why we've come from such a long distance to you is because we've heard about your God and what he can do. Now, of course, they were implying, I think they were implying, we want to become believers in your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites, Sihon and Og, who were beyond the Jordan. So Sihon, the king of Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth, we've heard about all of that. What you have done, or what he has done through you to those kings. We've heard about your victories. It's interesting that they did not say, we've heard what you did to Jericho and Ai, because, of course, that would have given away the fact that they were close by. We heard the news of what happened quite some time ago, way back in our country. Very, very clever, very cunning. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, the elders and all the inhabitants of our country, we've all agreed to this. Take provisions in your hand for the journey and go to meet them and say to them, we are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us. So go, take all. The provisions, of course, they're suggesting were new when they left off. Here's our bread, verse 12. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as our food for the journey on the day we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. And they've continued to ferment, of course. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. Wow. Very persuasive. Very clever. So the men took some of their provisions. I asked myself, what on earth does that mean? Did it mean they took some of their old, moldy, crumbly bread? I don't think they ate it, but they may have taken it to look at it more closely. Who knows? But they did not ask counsel from the Lord. If you're going to underline something in this chapter, that's the phrase you underline. They did not ask counsel from the Lord. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct thy paths. James 1:5. If any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth it not. They didn't ask from the Lord. They based their decision on what their own eyes could see. They did not ask counsel from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. So Joshua, I take it, took the lead in making this covenant. But all of the leaders of the congregation agreed to the covenant and took an oath to them. You know, today's society, how much difference would that oath have made? Not much, if any. If you don't have it in writing, you don't have it. But in those days, if you took an oath, particularly if you were an Israelite, you took an oath, you had better fulfill that oath. And we'll see in a moment or two what happened to Israel when they didn't. So the congregation made this oath. They did not inquire of the Lord. So Joshua made a treaty with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. And then verse 16 reads, at the end of 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and that they lived among them. How did they hear that? Did somebody overhear some Gibeonites talking with one another and the truth slipped out? Or did they get closer to Gibeon? The people of, continued in verse 17, the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Kephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. So I take it that if I rightly understand the connection between verses 16 and 17, they heard the information and Israel continued to move, and they found out by seeing the truth. They had lied. Israel had been deceived. But the people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders. You see, in the law, God had already told his people, when you take an oath, you must fulfill it. And I want to take just a minute and go over to 2 Samuel chapter 21. 2 Samuel chapter 21. And we're going to see what happened later on in Israel's history when they did not honor this oath. 2 Samuel chapter 21 and verses 1 and 2. Now, we're moving quite a ways in the future. We're going through the reign of Saul for about 40 years, and we're into the reign of David. And 2 Samuel 21:1 reads, now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, there's blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he put the Gibeonites to death. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. And because of that, God brought this famine that lasted for 3 years on the people of Israel, the whole nation. And David's waiting for God to bless his people. As far as David knows, they've been doing what they're supposed to do. And normally he would expect on the basis of Deuteronomy that God would bless his people with the abundance of crops. But no crops, or few crops, 3 years in a row. By the 3rd year, things have to be very hard up. And so David comes before the Lord, what's going on here, Lord? What's happened? And the Lord revealed to him that the reason for this famine is because God was chastening his people because of what Saul had done to the Gibeonites. Now, the text, if you notice that I read it, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. But Saul was not a wise man. Saul demonstrated that he wasn't on multitudes of occasions. And what he had done violated this oath. And because of this oath, God brought this famine on the people of Israel. Now, later on in the context, I won't read it, but later on, the discipline that was administered was that the Gibeonites said, look, this isn't about money, this is about people. And so they asked for sons of Saul to be delivered over to them, and they executed them, all but Mephibosheth, whom David protected because of his oath to Jonathan. Now, a couple of things right here. First, You and I are to be people who tell the truth. You and I are to be people who stick by our word. And whether we take an oath in the name of the Lord or not, our word should be our bond. I think that's what Jesus had in mind in his prohibition of oaths in the New Testament, in the Sermon on the Mount. I think his point was, let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. So that you don't have to swear, you just tell the truth. Tell the truth. And stick by your word. And so, that's what Israel does under Joshua. The people of Israel did not attack them, verse 18 of Joshua 9. But the people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders. But all the leaders said to the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. This we will do to them. Let them live, lest wrath be upon us, as was encountered later on, because of the oath that we swore to them. And the leaders said to them, let them live. So they became cutters of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders had said to them. Let's see here. Hold off for a little while, Bob, on that. So that's what they do. And Joshua summoned them, and he said to them, why did you deceive us, saying we are very far from you, when you dwell among us? You lied. Now, therefore, you are cursed, and some of you shall never be anything but servants, cutters of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. They answered Joshua, because it was told to your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you and did this thing. Now, God brought good out of the deception. That doesn't justify the deception. God brought good out of the deception. God also brought good out of the deception for Israel as well as for the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were forced to become cutters of wood and carriers of water. And I guess now we'll go there. Go with me to, let's see. Maybe I didn't write it down after all. In the text earlier on, as maybe it's Deuteronomy chapter 29. Let's go there for a minute. That may be what I'm looking for. Deuteronomy 29, verses 10 and 11. Yes, this is it. Moses is in the process of renewing the covenant with his people Israel. And what I want you to look for is the order of the categories of people that are mentioned in this text. Moses said, you are standing today, all of you, before the Lord your God, the heads of your tribes, your elders and your officers, heads of your tribes, your elders, your officers, all the men of Israel, your little ones, your wives, and the sojourner who is in your camp, the guy who's not an Israelite, from the one who chops your wood to the one who draws your water. So they are at the bottom of the social ladder, the people who chop wood and draw water. So when Joshua says to the Gibeonites, you're going to be choppers of wood and drawers of water, that's what he's saying to them. You're going to be in the bottom rung of the social ladder. However, you can still live. And the Gibeonites were drawers of water and choppers of wood primarily for the tabernacle and later on for the temple. What does that mean for the Gibeonites? It means they're going to be around the priests and the Levites. They're going to have a better chance of hearing about God's truth than probably anybody else. So God was going to bring good even for the Gibeonites, not only allowing them to live, but he's going to bring good for them in the future. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. It would be kind of like I suppose, a person getting assigned community service to be the gardener and the custodian at Grace Bible Church. They're going to have jobs to do that maybe they don't want to do, but they're going to be around the people of God. And that was the case with the Gibeonites. God brought good for the Gibeonites out of this. And there's a sense in which he also brought good to the people of Israel in it. Let me go a little further, and then I'll come back to that. They said in verse 25, "And now behold, we are in your hand. Whatever seems good and right in your sight to do to us, do it." So he did this to them and delivered them out of the hand of the people of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day cutters of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place that the Lord would choose for the tabernacle and the temple to dwell. Now, what I tell you next is not from Joshua chapter 9, but I want to illustrate the fact that God continued to bring good out of this difficult situation. In the very next chapter that we'll look at, God willing, 2 weeks from tonight, because there's no evening service next Sunday, in that passage, Israel is going to save the Gibeonites from extinction because of the promise that they had made. God saved the Gibeonites twice. Once when Israel did not exterminate them, and in chapter 10, when other enemies did not exterminate them. Because you see, the other ethnic groups found out that the Gibeonites had made a treaty with Israel, and they got so angry with the Gibeonites, they wanted to exterminate them. But God used the people of Israel to preserve their lives. In the days of Saul and David, they were still living in Gibeon, and they were still to be cared for righteously. I read that passage from 2 Samuel 21 a moment or two ago. And then in 1 Kings chapter 3, let's go there. 1 Kings chapter 3 and verses 1 through 5. We'll see more information about the Gibeonites and God's kindness to them. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places. However, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord, that's what they were doing. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was a great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. The Gibeonites had an opportunity to be a part of this. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon gave him his answer. So it was at this very Gibeon that God spoke to Solomon in a dream. So the Gibeonites had an opportunity to hear more and more about the God of Israel. And two other passages quickly. Ezra chapter 2, verse 25. Many years passed, the united monarchy, then the divided monarchy, and then the northern kingdom goes captive to Assyria, the southern kingdom goes captive to Babylon, and they are there for 70 years. And under Ezra and Nehemiah, the returns go on. And in the enumeration of the exiles who return, Ezra chapter 2, verse 25, we read these words. The sons of Kiriath Jearim, Kephirah, and Beeroth are among those who return. These three are the cities of the Gibeonites. I suspect, I can't prove this, I suspect that we're supposed to understand that Gibeonites had become proselytes to Israel, believing the God of Israel, and they had been taken captive as well. And now they are among those who return. And then Nehemiah, Ezra, Nehemiah chapter 3 and verse 7. Nehemiah is working to rebuild the walls around the city. And among those who rebuild the walls, verse 7, next to them repaired Melathiah, the Gibeonite, and Jadon, the Meronothite, the men of Gibeon and of Mizpah, the seat of the governor of the province beyond the river. So among those who returned and worked hard at rebuilding the wall were these citizens of Gibeon. I suspect we're supposed to understand that they are Gibeonites that, again, became believers in the Lord. God brought good out of this difficult situation when Joshua and the leaders of Israel made a foolish decision that also involved sin because they didn't consult the Lord. Now, the good thing for me is this. If God can bring good out of this foolish decision on the part of Gideon and the leaders of Joshua and the leaders of Israel, God can do the same thing out of the foolish decisions that I make. And it gives me great hope. I'm so glad that he's that kind of a sovereign God. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for an opportunity, Lord, to get together again tonight. I pray, Father, you would bless us. I pray that day after day you would first help us to make wise decisions. But, Lord, when in our foolishness, in our carelessness, because we are foolish and careless, when we make unwise decisions, remind us, Lord, that you don't just say, well, you've made your bed, you can lie in it. You don't throw us away. In your great love, you continue to persevere with us. You continue to work out your good and wise plan, even in spite of the bad decisions that we make. You are truly an awesome God. We thank you and we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.